Hi, Jennifer, Stuart here. I am so excited to have with me today Dr. Victoria Dunckley. She's an award-winning integrative child psychiatrist, author, and children's health advocate based in Los Angeles. She's a leading expert on the impact of screen time on the developing brain. We know about all of that going on right now in the media and everything, and coined the term electronic screen syndrome to describe how technology overstimulates the nervous system, creating and exacerbating mental health, learning, and behavioral issues in children. Recently named one of America's top psychiatrists, Dr. Dunckley is a regular contributor for Psychology Today and has been featured on such media outlets as Good Morning America, NPR, Fox News, The Today Show, and Scholastic News. So she's been quite busy. She's the author of the groundbreaking book, Reset Your Child's Brain, a 4-week plan, oh, I like the shortness of that, to end meltdowns, raise grades, and boost social skills by reversing the effects of electronic screen time. I love all of those topics in your book. I think every parent wants to solve that problem. So, hi, Victoria, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
I am so glad to have you on here because this is definitely one of the biggest issues that I have seen develop over the last 10 years I've been running my preschool. So I think it's so great that you have been spending time researching this and getting information out there so parents can know about how it's affecting their kids. It saddens me to see that it's already happening with these little itty bitty kids that I work with. And I think if parents can understand it, then they're going to want to do something about it because we
Yes.
want the kids to be amazing. So,
Yes.
and I'm curious, what first sparked your interest in this field? How'd you get started on it?
Well, I first got interested in this because when I finished my training in the early 2000s, I was working with foster care kids, group home kids, and those kids had all been either abused or neglected or both. And so they were already prone to, had kind of a hair trigger response to going into fight or flight.
Sure.
So for those kids, we noticed if they played video games, even a little bit, they tended to be more reactive and more irritable, crying, would become aggressive. And conversely, if we removed video games altogether, a lot of their symptoms would go away and they would start to make progress in their treatment. And one of the residential places I was working at, the kids actually lived there. So we actually were able to do a little experiment, and we removed video games from one of the houses. There was 3 houses.
Okay.
And within 30 days, their behavior incidents had dropped by 30%.
Oh my God.
So yeah,
That's
so
incredible.
that was, yeah, it was incredible. So then after that, I started implementing that same intervention with patients in my private practice. And I started to realize that no matter what they had, whether it was ADHD or anxiety or bipolar or OCD, like they all got better. So I started to realize it was that the gaming was just putting them into a state of stress.
Wow.
And kind of shutting down their frontal lobe so they couldn't function very well. And then I started realizing, even kids that didn't have diagnoses kind of looked like these other kids. So then, I started sharing information on my website, and I got a ton of interest on it. And then I ended up, writing the book on it.
Is this all types of video games you're talking about now, or was it just specific ones? Or
It's really all types. I've been doing this for over 15 years now, and a lot of the parents I see nowadays, especially if they're, more educated parents, like they only use educational tools, and they're very choosy about what they're letting their kids see, and they may even be restricting it pretty well. And a lot of them don't watch TV and stuff like that, but we still see the same symptoms, and we know this because when we remove the gaming, those educational games, the child gets better. So when I started looking at the physiology of it, like how screen time impacts the brain, a lot of it has, very little to do with content. So even educational content is overstimulating. So it's really the screen itself and interacting with the screen that's the problem.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible to think, because I think so many parents think, okay,
Yes.
they're learning on the screen, so it's okay. It's totally
Right.
okay because they're learning their letters, or they're practicing their math or whatever it is. So
Right. And even, even professionals like, the American Academy of Pediatrics, like everyone's hoping that this education that, kind of puts this educational screen time in a different category.
Right.
And they really shouldn't be, because it really all does the same thing. The brain can't really, the brain's not saying, oh, this is educational versus this isn't educational. It's the brain's just reacting to the stimulation.
Yeah, no, that's interesting too, because I know in schools now, in public schools, they're trying to implement a lot of things using technology for the kids to make it more interesting or
Yes.
exciting, or so
Yes.
I guess that becomes really confusing then, like, okay, well, they're doing it at school, so
Right. It's terrible. The travesty. And then it becomes a vicious cycle, because you're constantly what we call chasing the dragon. You're constantly trying to get them interested and engaged, because that's how they're already used to being entertained that way. And
right.
so you just have to make things more and more stimulating and exciting and interesting. And it's just a vicious cycle.
Yeah, well, and I know, and I think, I hear in the media a lot that there's a lot more diagnosis, right, of like ADHD and autism
Mm-hmm.
and all that. So, I'm sure you've seen that that's got to be correlated then with the prevalence now of screens in our society. I mean, that's got to be going hand in hand of
Yes.
maybe that.
Yes. And yeah, that's what I was seeing, was a lot of diagnoses of ADHD. Some kids were being called bipolar, um, or, looked like they had autism. And then we remove the screens and, lo and behold, all their symptoms would go away, or at least get dramatically better. They may still have had some of those symptoms or the diagnosis, but it was way better. And then, but the problem with that is that kids were actually being medicated unnecessarily. And then, those medications have side effects too. So it's a huge problem. And that was really the impetus for me to do something bigger about the problem, because I was seeing so many kids misdiagnosed and being medicated.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's scary
It
to think
is.
about that. Wow. So how can a parent then begin to tune in? I mean, there's going to be screens, right, around. They're just in our society, unless you find a way to move out to the country and homeschool and just don't interact with. So how do parents like tune into when is there too much? What are some of the very first symptoms you think?
Yeah. So the keys for the parents is really the education piece first. So I think, when we start talking about this, parents really, they get overwhelmed. So like, how are we going to do this? What are we going to do? But really, just to educate yourself first, and to really understand the physiology of what's going on. So like I said earlier, the screen actually causes a fight or flight response. So every time a child interacts with a screen device, there's multiple mechanisms going on that trigger this fight or flight response, or put them in a state of what we call hyperarousal. So that includes, it activates the reward system, which gets overactivated and then becomes desensitized. So that's what, releases the dopamine, or the reward chemicals in the brain. And then there's all this intense sensory input. So, there's vivid colors, there's bright lights, there's a lot of movement going on, changing scenes, and then the content itself is stimulating too. And then there's the blue light from the screen, which desynchronizes the body clock. It's very stimulating. And once the body clock goes off, that actually affects all your hormones, as well as other brain chemicals like serotonin. And then there's, the multitasking that goes on, and maybe that's more with older kids, but, kids tend to be on a screen and then they're watching TV, and then, they might be doing something else as well. So that also raises arousal levels. And then there's the radiation from the device, and Wi-Fi, if they're using that too. That there's evidence that also triggers these stress hormones. So all these things are kind of acting synergistically to raise arousal levels, and then which eventually dysregulates the brain, and it just starts to malfunction. So what happens when the brain's in a state of stress is the frontal lobe just sort of shuts down. It gets like short-circuited. And the frontal lobe controls executive functioning and mood regulation, getting things done, impulse control, as well as other things like creativity and empathy. So, when you're constantly suppressing the frontal lobe or short-circuiting it, those are the things that get harmed. So the child's, the brain is literally operating from a more primitive state, and then you see the
Those are
child
important
act
functions.
more primitively. Yeah. So you're literally making them more immature and more, primitive, really.
Yeah. No, that's scary. I mean, you touched on so many important things in that little brief time there. You definitely brought up, they're expecting immediate rewards, immediate gratification. I see that a lot now with the kids as well. They're looking for constant, like they do something and they want immediate like feedback that what they did was good, as opposed to just doing it because it
Yes.
feels good. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then you mentioned the blue light in the background of a screen. And I think that's interesting because it's not going to only affect their hormones, but then serotonin is going to affect your sleep cycle. And I know so
Exactly.
many parents struggle with getting their kids to sleep, especially, younger ones. I mean,
Yes.
that's something else I've seen more and more of is a lot of kids in my preschool yawning all day.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I know these parents are trying to get them to bed, but I don't think they're sleeping well.
Exactly. And for kids, it really doesn't take very much. They can have 10 minutes of the iPad in the evening or even earlier in the day. That's the other thing is some of the recommendations say, oh, just avoid screens before bedtime. But that's not true for kids. You actually, the amount of screen time they're getting throughout the day also affects their body clock and keeps them awake and alert. So kids, they go to bed and they're kind of in this hyper aroused, exhausted, but revved up state. Then the next day they're tired. So what do you do when you're tired? You seek more stimulation to wake yourself up. And then it's just a vicious cycle once again.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's interesting, I guess that the recommendation is not to have screens before bedtime, but most of the families I know, that's the time that they put it on is mom's tired, dad's
Yes.
tired, everybody's tired. It's like, all right, we made it through dinner. Everybody's alive.
Right.
So like have a little show before bedtime so mommy can breathe.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Then I guess, but then then they're going to have a hard time falling asleep.
Right.
So it's almost, that's probably the worst time to do it. And it's interesting because I don't know that people really think about that. Because I think as an adult, right, like we like to watch, if we're going to watch TV, it's often in the evening when we're winding down and relaxing. So,
Yeah. And I think, that's one of the things I talk about is that the interactive component is way more stimulating than say watching TV.
yeah. So this is more video games you're talking about. Yeah.
Right. Video games, iPad, texting, social media.
Okay.
But for kids who are but the exception to that is if they're watching TV on a device. So if they're watching it on an iPad or on a phone or whatever, it's because it's so close and because it's still interactive. They can, they're still interacting with the device. But also a lot of the times kids this age are watching cartoons, and cartoons today are way different than they were, 30 years ago. They're much more fast paced. They're much more intense. I tried watching something the other day because someone sent me a link of, have you seen this kind of thing? And I could not even tolerate watching it. It was so awful. And it was a Sesame Street one, so it wasn't even that bad.
Yeah.
But it was visually and the auditory was so much overload. I was like, it's terrible.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then I definitely think it's interesting that you brought up as well, it's important to remember that the frontal lobe is in control of the creativity and the impulse control, because those are some of the other things. I mean, I've seen issues more and more with is, kids not, when they have an art project, for example, or they have free play time, they don't know what to do with that unless it's like a direct, like make this by gluing this here, attaching that there, they're like, what do you mean I can, paint something I did over summer that was fun? Like, how would I do that?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. And honestly, like what you're describing right there, the middle school teachers are describing the same thing.
Sure.
Like kids need so much instruction and repeating the instruction. They don't know how to self-direct.
Yeah.
So, it's just a huge issue.
Right, because we want to grow and create thinkers that can go out into the world as adults and solve problems and make new solutions. And so we want to keep that a part of their brain alive and growing,
of course.
right? Not squash
Right.
it. Yeah,
Yes.
no, and then obviously, impulse control is a huge thing. I mean, that's one of the things I can usually sense for me that's really obvious when I
Mm-hmm.
think that there's a child who probably is on a screen a lot, is they are not able to sit for like 30 seconds. I mean, it becomes a little, and they're constant like running around, and compared to the rest of the children, obviously preschoolers, we don't ask them to sit for super long, but there's a certain amount of time that's normal. And
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think, on top of them being overstimulated, so they're trying to discharge that energy from being overstimulated, but they're also trying to discharge that energy because of all the minutes they've been sitting,
Yeah.
restrained by the device. And there's occupational therapists that literally describe the devices as a restraint, a physical restraint, because kids are supposed to be moving, pretty much constantly.
Right.
And they need several hours of really rigorous activity every day. So when they're sitting, even for 30 minutes, that's 30 minutes that they should have been discharging energy. So you're like putting them in this state of fight or flight, where fight or flight makes you're supposed to discharge that energy. Yeah. Combined with being sedentary, it's like it's an explosive combination. So they're either going to act out, or they're going to be anxious, or in older kids they start to get depressed. But that energy has to go somewhere.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because I think that parents don't think about the fact that their kid is sitting still. I think they think it's calming to the child,
Right.
because the kid's
Right.
sitting still, but instead they're building up all that energy inside. So it's like, all right, if you're going to have your kid on a screen for 30 minutes, you better get them out to the playground for 30 minutes after that to
exactly
that out.
Yeah. And really, like what you were saying, like, parents are using it at the end of the day because they're exhausted. But that's why one of the reasons why they're exhausted is because the kid hasn't been able to discharge that energy. And then you're compounding the issue, by giving them another screen. And then there's more energy that's pent up.
Yeah.
So, parents, that's the kind of counterintuitive part that parents need to understand, is that once they really start to, either work with my program or just really cut back on screens, is that the child is much less impulsive. They start to play more. They start to self-direct, and they go outside more naturally. So the parent isn't as exhausted.
Right.
So, that's a hurdle, a mental hurdle that parents really need to get over, but it really does make their life better.
Yeah, no, definitely. So what are some ways then that you can give for parents to begin to pull off that Band-Aid and start getting away from that?
Yeah. So, I mean, let me just say that it does help to cut back. The research shows that parents who just try to cut back, that it does make a difference in terms of grades, weight, and I forget, there was one more factor. I think sleep. It does help just to try to cut back. However, I always advocate that parents really do a 4-week electronic fast or a screen fast for 4 weeks, because the impact is so much greater, and it's a way to not only improve their mood and their focus and behavior and sleep, but it also helps you realize how much screen time they can actually tolerate, if any. Okay. So what happens is all those things that I was talking about that are going on in the brain, all those things start to reverse. And in this age, preschool age kids, you'll see it start to reverse within a few days. Okay. So, this is much easier to do at this age. So they'll start playing, they'll start, going outside, they'll start doing things creatively. Depending on how much exposure the child had, it may take a little bit longer for some kids to start playing with, doing a creative play again. But it will happen. It does that. We are naturally meant to be that way. Kids will naturally start to do that. So parents are so scared of their kids not having anything to do or being bored, but they will naturally start to play again. But in order to prevent the parent from being too anxious about that, in our program, we really structure, especially the first week, of activities, things they can do on their own, things they can do with siblings, or other screen-free things with their friends, and of course, spending a lot of time with the family. Yeah. So that way that the parent doesn't freak out when they take away the screens. But and also just over doing this for many years and hundreds of families, I've realized that most families, when they try to cut back, they don't see that big of a difference. So they're like, well, what's the point? It's too exhausting anyway. Um, so again, doing the fast, it's only for 4 weeks, so that it's psychologically it's easier to, kind of stomach that than thinking about giving it up forever. But if they do that for 4 weeks, then they can see the difference.
And how about like for school age kids that are going to go through that, but then they go to school and they're on a computer? Is that,
Yeah.
what do you?
So that we kind of do case by case. Most of the time, if we do everything at home and they're on the computer at school a little bit, it's okay. In some cases, most of the time that's fine. Like most of the time we don't address what's going on at school. But in some cases, most of their screen time is happening at school. So for those kids, we might see if we can opt them out of those one-to-one programs. I sometimes, for my own patients, I write a doctor's note saying this child is to be off all screens for 4 weeks. If the child's having a lot of issues at school, sometimes they'll buy into that and say, okay, we'll just do this as an experiment. And then for things like homework, we try to get the work done at school if possible, do the homework as early in the evening as possible. Or sometimes I just tell parents, just tell the school you're not doing any of that computer homework. If they're not going to cooperate, just don't do it for now. Yeah. So it kind of depends on case by case, but yeah, school is becoming a huge issue.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, and I think you answered one of my other questions then, is if overexposure is going to cause permanent effects or if it can be reversed, because it sounds like you're saying it won't cause permanent damage. Is that?
I mean, the jury's still out really, because we don't, this is just happening now. We don't know, in each generation that comes up, those kids are having more exposure than even the kids from 5 years before them. So, the millennials we see now still didn't have the kind of exposure that kids are getting now. Right. So the addiction studies show that the imaging studies that have been done in adolescents and young adults show there's actual brain damage in the frontal lobe, which matches exactly what we see clinically. But there's certain, there's atrophy of certain areas in the frontal lobe. And then there's also the white matter, which is how the brain connects. That is more spotty or more fragmented. And that's kind of how the whole brain integrates, to itself and to the body. Sure. So, which is very frightening. It looks just like substance abuse, like either alcohol or drug abuse. It's the same kind of damage. So what we don't know is how much of that reverses. So there have been some studies that show like the wilderness camps, like if kids who are addicted went into a wilderness camp for 12 weeks or whatever, then they re-scanned the brain. Dramatic difference.
Wow.
So yeah. So we think it's probably much more reversible than say drug or alcohol use, but it's different because there's so much more ingrained in our society. And this is the first time that there's ever been an addictive addictive activity that we give to kids. This has never happened before.
Right.
So, in many ways it's harder because, we expect these kids to beat the addiction and then somehow live in our society. So in that sense, I think the damage is reversible in theory, but it's very hard to treat tech addiction once they're, a young adult.
Yeah, no, I guess maybe it depends on how much and how long the exposure was to know.
Yes. And one of the things that's really protective is attachment. So the parent-child relationship is crucial. So when we do these 4-week fasts, you can't do it without spending time with the child. Yeah. And the parent needs to be off their devices as well. So, and what we know is that with addiction studies in general is that addiction really hijacks the social pathways, the social reward pathways. So when we get those dopamine hits, those pathways are actually meant to be keeping the child close to the mother from an evolutionary point of view. That's why we have those tracks. So those are the tracks that get hijacked with any kind of addiction, including tech addiction. So the stronger that the parent-child relationship is, the more that protects against tech addiction. So it's almost like you're rewiring those tracks to help protect the child.
Wow.
So that component is super important to keep strengthening, throughout the child's life.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that I also see that with relationships with the kids, with each other. So it sounds like it's breaking that whole part down where they're not craving that from people because now they're getting that from the
Yes.
device. So it's really interesting to see.
And also, eye contact, especially again at this age, is one of the most critical things for brain development. And when their eyes are on the screen, they're obviously not getting eye contact. And when the parents' eyes are on the screen, they're not getting eye contact.
Yeah.
And then, in the classroom, the teacher should be looking at them as well. So face-to-face conversation is also one of the things we know that affects brain development. So when kids are sitting there, on the computer, instead of looking at the teacher's face, that's another thing that is hindering their development.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good point, because if a teacher's teaching off of a screen, you're going to have to be looking at the screen to be clicking around and getting, I hadn't thought about that. That's a really good point as well.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, on your website, do you have pictures of some of the brain, like before and after pictures, if people wanted to look that up? Or
I don't have it on my website. I do have an article called Gray Matters, Too Much Screen Time Damages the Brain. That's on Psychology Today.
Okay.
I do have one imaging picture on there of the it's not a before and after, it's a damaged one, but I can try to look that up. Actually, that's a good point, because I think it's really powerful to see not just the damage, but the wilderness therapy intervention is. I think that would be really powerful for parents to see as well.
Yeah, because I think if parents knew, like deep down, that this is affecting their child's brain, like physically affecting it and altering
exactly.
Yeah, that I think then it would really get them to want to make a change, because I know that parents, like, they love their kids, right? And they're not trying to harm them, of course.
Right,
So,
exactly.
Yeah,
and I think you're right. I think what I've noticed is that parents really respond to the science. They really need to understand why what's happening, how is it impacting the child's brain, and how does that translate into symptoms and behavior issues.
Yeah.
So if they really understand the why, and then if they can see something like the imaging, that's really powerful. But just telling them, oh, this is making your child behave like this, it's not usually helpful, because they're already stressed out, and
like
they need to know why. They need to understand the rationale.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's why I really love that you've been studying it in that way. So I guess then if parents, have a child who then is diagnosed with ADHD or autism or something like that, I mean, maybe one of the first things they do before going on medication is to try your program, or to try it on their own, to remove screens for, it sounds like, at least a month. And
exactly.
See if they can resolve some of the issues before adding medication that's going to cause other side effects.
Exactly. So, if they're getting told by a pediatrician or a teacher, I think your child has this diagnosis, or your child has a learning issue, or, they may need special ed, or, any of those things, or a lot of times a parent's about to fork over, $4,000 to do, some kind of treatment. That's when you should do it. When you're at your wit's end, or you're about to spend a lot of money, or you're considering medication, do this first. It's a no-brainer. It's free. I've had many people do it just from my email course alone. And of course, thousands more have done it with the book. So you don't need me necessarily. But I think, parents really can do this on their own. That was why I wrote the book, because I knew this intervention is so powerful.
Yeah. No, I love that. That's amazing. So if you were to give, I always like to ask, if you were to give parents of young children one piece of advice, one thing to focus on, what would that be?
Oh, good question. I think the one thing that makes the biggest difference in terms of research is no screens in the bedroom. So just doing that one thing, no TV, don't allow your child to take a phone in there, don't allow them to game in there, or take their device in there. That one thing makes a big difference in terms of outcome.
Okay.
So, of course, I recommend lots of other things.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think is really important is for parents to ask their kids how the child feels about the parents' use, because that can be really eye-opening, and to just listen without getting defensive and saying, oh, but I have to do it for work, or trying to explain why they have to be on their phone or whatever. That's really can be really eye-opening and can create a shift for the parent to realize, gosh, this is really a family issue.
Yeah. Yes. Well, with anything, we're modeling for our kids. So
Yeah.
yeah.
But it's modeling, but also kids feel hurt by it. When parents are on their devices, kids are constantly feeling it's a little tiny rejection each time the parent looks at their phone instead of the child, or they're half listening because they're checking, their texts at the same time, or daddy comes home and he goes, straight to the computer. Those are little rejections. So the child's like, well, if I'm going to be alone, I'm just going to turn to my device anyway, So it's really important for parents to hear from the child, like how it makes them feel, how they feel like, mommy or daddy doesn't listen, or mommy or daddy doesn't play with me. That can kind of strike a chord with a parent that might help them make a change.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, I think the work you're doing is so important, and I want parents to learn more about the science behind it, so they don't just feel like it's people, teachers or whoever telling them their opinion on it, making this up. So if people want to learn more about your research and your resources, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
So, I mean, by far and away, the most comprehensive resource is the book, Reset Your Child's Brain. There's tons of patient stories, case studies, as well as research, and also examples of different, how it presents differently. So some kids, present with anxiety or depression or acting out, or if they have attachment issues or whatever. So the second resource is my blogs on Psychology Today. It's called Mental Wealth, and there's a ton of articles on there about screen time, as well as research about different topics. One of the most popular articles, besides that Gray Matters article, it's called "Screen Time is Making Kids Moody, Crazy, and Lazy," and that one I recommend because it's short and concise, and it breaks down kind of just the mechanisms.
Do they need to go to psychologytoday.com to find those ones, or are those on a website that you have?
Those are on my website as well, but they can go to Psychology Today, or just Google "Screen Time is making kids moody, crazy, lazy," and it'll come up. And then also on my website, I have a free email course. It's drdunkley.com/video games. And that's kind of the quick and dirty version of the 4-week electronic fast I was talking about. So that is it's a 4-day email course. It's easy to digest. It's easy to give to a spouse if your spouse doesn't want to read the whole book. So I definitely recommend parents look at that as well.
That's amazing. Yeah, I hope that more and more people can get out there and learn about that and make these changes, because, like I said, I'm seeing a big swing with these small children I work with, these preschool aged kids. So
yeah, and it's so much easier to treat it now than to treat it later. It's so hard to treat when they're older. Even by the time they're teens, you can still treat it, and I definitely treat a lot of teens and young adults.
Yeah.
And effectively, you can turn things around even then, but it's so much harder. So if parents really understand what's going on now, and the last thing I want to do is make parents feel bad about giving their kids a screen, or you don't want to do anything like that.
Yeah,
they don't know. Nobody knew. Even doctors don't know really. So it's I just want parents to kind of be aware, and also to tell them, like, I'm not telling you this to make your life more stressful. This will make your life better. The parents a lot of times say, oh my gosh, my stress level is so much better, and we're connecting more as a family, and we have more conversations, and they laugh more. There's so many benefits, and kids start reading more. It's really incredible.
I love that. That's amazing. And so what was your website one more time?
It's drdunkley.com. It's DRDUNCKLEY.com. Okay. And then that email, of course, is actually on the main website too, but it's /video games is the actual page.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I'll have it in the email. It's with this interview, but just in case someone's listening to this afterward. Great.
Okay.
Perfect. Well, Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you for having me.